Hi and hello watch fans, and welcome to another edition of The Real Time Show with me, your friendly neighbourhood watchmaker Rob Nuds, and my co-host Alon Ben Joseph. Once again, we are sitting side by side for an in-person interview with one of the watch industry's most beloved collectors, experts, and now accidental ambassadors, Gary Shteyngart. The famous, I was told, you were introduced to me as the famous New York writer.
The famous New York writer. Wow. Yeah. Well, I used to be famous for writing, but now when people stop me on the street, they're just like, hey, what are you wearing? Wow. Nobody cares about literature. They just want more Bauhaus-inspired watches out of me.
Well, that's no bad thing. I think we all want more Bauhaus-inspired watches. And how is it that you came to be recognizable on the street? What did you do to get yourself in the watch industry consciousness?
In 2016, I published an article in the New Yorker magazine called Confessions of a Watch Geek. And the article detailed my descent, I would call it nothing less than descent, into the world of watches. And as it coincided with certain political events in America, the rise of a certain orange man. And so watches became, as you know, we were all watching the news incessantly, and now next year we will also be doing that. Watches became a kind of refuge for me. So I'd never had a hobby before. I don't golf, I don't sail, I barely move. And also I don't have like, I know a lot of men specifically have cars. I just learned to drive very recently because I live in the country half the time. I'm a terrible driver. We just picked the safest car according to the reports and bought it. And, so I haven't killed anyone yet because it keeps stopping me from killing anyone. So, but I've never had any passion for anything other than watches. And I've always had watches as part of my life growing up, but never a mechanical watch. One day I went to the MoMA design shop in New York. I saw a young Hans Max Bill. I thought it was incredible. I thought, wow, this is, my idea of a watch was like a golden Rolex Day-Date or something. I thought, that's a nice watch. Not a watch I'd ever have. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. Sorry to divert this, but in many Korean culture, my wife's Korean American, when you marry, you get a Rolex Datejust, And I remember when we were getting married a couple of years before I fell into watches, my wife said, yeah, my family wants to offer you like a Rolex. And I was like, oh no, that's so gauche. I don't want that. Tell them thank you very much. I know it's a tradition, but Rolex, I look like a doofus. Now I'm like, what the fuck? Why did I do that? In any case, so I saw the Max Bill, and then I saw the price. It was like $1,000. I thought, who the hell pays that much for a watch?
Really? That's what you thought the first time? So you thought it was a lot?
I thought it was a lot. I mean, I thought, okay, I don't know what a Rolex goes for, but this is not a Rolex, right? This is young Hans Max Bill. And then we bought it, and again, I didn't know what an automatic watch was. So it died, of course, because again, I barely moved, so didn't get enough wrist action, so to speak. And my wife is a lawyer, and she's very good at making sort of angry phone calls to places. And she called Mr. Junghans or something. Oh, right. It's like, my husband, we bought this watch. It was a special occasion. It wasn't. It doesn't work. And he's like, your husband must turn his head. So then I was like, okay, this is interesting. So watches aren't battery powered. They rely on winding or motion of the wrist. Okay. So I began to really research this stuff. So I spent days, hours, and I mentioned in the article that novelists, we don't work that much. After 4 hours a day, your brain's already exploded. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of time for stuff to do. And I never had a hobby, like I said. I usually just drank myself stupid. But watches became a kind of, a healthier activity than drinking. And I quickly understood not just how automatic versus manual watches, et cetera, work. I understood, everything, starting with Hodinkee, which Ben was still writing a lot for them back then. And there was a lot of both technical, aesthetic, historical, quasi-spiritual stuff in there, and also my feeling was that for watches, many of them served as a kind of connection to, I love unisex watches such as the one I'm wearing, but a lot of men have difficult relationships with their fathers, as opposed to a more understandable relationship with their mothers. And so the watch becomes a kind of totemic thing that's passed down. It's almost like, sorry I didn't spend any time with you. Here's a watch, and now I'm going to die. Goodbye. but that was so. And then I met like Hradek and the author of Man and His Watch, and I understood why that book sold so incredibly well, because I think it really hit the right mark for people trying to understand their own. Because it wasn't just an object; it became for many people an object plus. It was a repository for things like memories and self-beliefs. My watch represents who I am. Clothes used to do this, but clothes is now just.
And how long did it take after you discovered exactly what went into watchmaking before the watch represented that to you? And then from that moment, how did you get out in front of the watchmaking community as a figure yourself?
Mm-hmm. So what happened was, I think, after the Max Bill, I bought the watch I'm wearing right now, which is the NOMOS Minimatic. And I bought that for, I think it was over $4,000 with tax. I was just like, what the, I mentioned this in the article. For a writer, I mean, I'm lucky that people still buy my books, but you never know. So I always I never bought any physical. I would buy real estate because you can sell that, but I would never really buy physical objects because I was like, I'd rather feel more secure and just spend the money on jamon serrano or something that I really enjoy, right? So I walked out of that store and there were so many feelings going through my mind, like, what did I do? But shell shocked, but also, wow, this is so beautiful. And I was just looking at it in the lights. This is the Champagner edition is very good at soaking up light. And then I would turn it over and look at the movement. Couldn't believe all of that stuff, that it was just that this tiny, tiny, very slender device contained such multitudes, as Walt Whitman would say. So after that, I bought an Air King, I think, and it was European watch company. I think it was $1,500.
What kind of time frame were we talking about here? Did you just go straight down the rabbit hole once you fell?
Straight down. 2016, I think I bought like 6 watches the first year. Yeah, right? So then I bought the Air King because it was $1,500. I was like, wow, Rolex for $1,500. Not bad. Actually, it's pretty good. I still have it. It's a very nice Air King. Then I was like, one exercise I do is I swim tons. I have a pool upstate, but sometimes I feel lazy. What would be better than having a water-resistant watch? And at that point, the Tudor Black Bay 36 came out, and I was like, oh, this is great. I love old Explorers. So I bought one of those. And then I started making friends with like Eric Wind and stuff like that. Danger. And I started talking to Eric, and I was like, yeah, I really love old gilt dials. And Eric was like, yeah, do you now? So I got like 2 incredible watches through him. One, the 1016, which with my miniature wrist looks absolutely beautiful. The exclamation dial, right? So it was between radium and tritium. I'm very afraid of radium. So that was just beautiful. And then I also got this watch that I still think is one of the best watches in my collection. It's a 1675 gilt dial. And I think that the GMT is the only, other than date, it's the only function that really means anything. Like I hate chronos because I never used them. So I got the 1675 and it had insane history to it. It belonged to an Air Force colonel who was sort of NASA's spokesman, and he was the liaison to Richard Nixon's White House. And he had to deal primarily with Spiro Agnew, one of the most corrupt vice presidents we ever had. And
could have been president.
Almost president. I know. No, it's bananas. And apparently, Agnew was like, yeah, do we really need to go to the moon? So much I can steal right here on Earth. But that watch had incredible, and he was an Air Force guy, so everything was ship shape and all the boxes, incredible documentation. He also bought various bezels for it, a root beer and a black bezel, and then he bought a Jubilee, and he bought every kind of bracelet and bezel imaginable. It was the fullest kit I've ever seen. And I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal about it, and that went very well. So anyway, as you can see, things started to ramp up. And by this point, people were like, oh, yeah, because I became sort of the watch whisperer. I became sort of like, it was what a lot of, especially men, I think, would show their spouses, like, this isn't just me buying watches. There's a underlying thing to it.
Do you think your presence in the industry, your sudden arrival here as someone writing on enormous platforms about watches, in some way added validation to those purchases for people, and you are maybe responsible for the investment industry that came after?
It's part, maybe. I mean, the New York Times now has its own watch rubric, right? Which I don't know how long it's been around, but it became this thing where people just fell in love with watches to such an extent, to the extent where it became a bubble very clearly. Because everyone, they always say if your taxi driver's talking about stocks with you, it's time to get out of the market. And, my doorman, God bless him, were like, oh, what do you, watches, et cetera. And I'm like, great, But what worried me immediately was this idea that this isn't just people falling in love with mechanical objects. It's either the most boring status symbol ever plus, or, flipping and resale and trying to time the market for entry and exit. So I've never bought anything above retail. And as an immigrant, I don't know how that would work. I'd probably kill myself. Yeah.
You expressed fascination with the completeness of the Rolex we were discussing previously. Now, does that matter to you in any way? Is it interesting from a historical or a personal perspective? But it sounds like it's certainly not interesting from an investment perspective, because you don't look at the hobby that way at all.
I've never sold anything. I'm getting up to the 30 watch mark, which is scary. A lot of them are not expensive watches, and a lot of them are now gifts that people send me so I put it on. I guess that's what an influencer does, right?
Yes.
Oh boy. Huh. Sorry, I just realized that.
You're a manfluencer now.
I'm a manfluencer. But I still, I've never sold them because they mean, this watch, I'm looking at this watch, right? This watch has been to Germany countless times, on a really weird trip to Venice, Rome, Tel Aviv. I don't know. I remember what that trip was about, but it happened. And I remember taking photos of this watch next to,
What happened in Venice?
Oh, I was presenting an Italian translation of a book. That's what it was. That's what it was. All right. But it was a very weird reading. It was not in Venice itself, but in the town opposite the lagoon.
Okay.
So they're like, you're not Venice ready, pal. You're going to the Hoboken of Venice, for New Yorker listeners. And then, so then invitations would come the Swiss consulate in Chicago asked me to speak to all these watch nerds. And that's the first time that somebody asked me to sign their strap. I thought that was very cool. And then I wrote a book called Lake Success, where premises that the main character is this sort of fallen hedge funder. He can't handle, he's learned that his son is severely autistic. He can't handle that. He can't handle anything. And him and a bag full of very expensive watches disappear on a Greyhound bus across the country. And so, various adventures happen. And a lot of them happened with me too, so at one point I was in the streets of Baltimore and I met a crack dealer, which was strange because it's usually about heroin these days. And I was like, what are you doing? Niche, very niche. Yeah. His ultimate line to me was, if you ain't buying rock, get the fuck off my block, which I used in the book. But he had such a fake AP. It was like Audemars Piguet's or something. I was like, this is...
Did you tell him?
Oh, yeah. This well-armed man, I was like, I'm sorry. Yeah, I hope you didn't pay over retail for that, because it's actually worth $10. It was weird. Like on the Hound, or the dog as we call it, there were a lot of fake watches. There were some, but really strange fake watches. There was a Piaget Polo knockoff. I was like, very, very strange. Yeah, and I had a lot of fun with. I think that book works. It's one of those books where you read about a culture, and if you know the culture, you can understand it more. I think watch nerds get so much more out of a culture than civilian readers who may not be familiar. There's a scene in the book where, he's getting down with this girl. He meets this girl, and they're about to have sex, and she opens up his special suitcase with the watches, and she says, "Oh, you're a watch salesman." And he's a hedge fund guy. And he's like, "Oh, no, not really." And she's like, "This watch is really nice." And he's like, "Yeah, it's an FP Journe, And she's like, "Oh, great. So I guess you're saving up for a Rolex." Yeah. So anyway, I had a lot of fun with that kind of stuff.
So Gary did an amazing job on actually telling the whole story. He makes it easy for us as interviewers. You made fun of yourself by saying, "Hey, I sound like an influencer." It almost sounds like that, but I actually read Lake Success, which I loved. You made you created tremendous layers of stories, which you touched upon right now. And your remark about the difficult relationships between dads and sons and connecting the watches, which you actually did in the book, because it came out, I believe, in 18. I read it. I just became a dad myself. So it was an emotional book for me on many levels, because I've never read where the main character, is a watch nerd as well. And that's amazing. And how you brought it to an end where he goes upstate. And I believe it was a Universal Genève that brings this the tranquility and sanity I don't dare to use. So circling back to your comment, I thought you're going to take it to the Oedipus complex with the father and son thing. Do you think that watches are therapeutic for watch nerds, and how?
Yeah, look, so, and this is, my New Yorker piece begins with this, and I'll be reading this on the stage, where I had a panic attack because I'm very claustrophobic, and I got trapped in the New York subway, and the movement of the seconds hand that was on a non-quartz watch, the Max Bill in this case, was somehow the only calming thing I could find. It's interesting because in some ways time should scare us because it's a record of mortality. I always talk with Jack Forrester about, I love his melancholy take on watches, but, I felt that for some reason it was soothing to see time instead of jerking and clicking the way a quartz watch does, to see it almost, do that spring drive thing where it floats right by. I also had a kid in 2013. So this was 3 years after he was born. I started writing the book, and it came out 5 years later. So fatherhood was weighing on me quite a bit. The idea of it, I never thought I would be a father. I just thought I'd be, a goof off forever, which is my favorite lifestyle. There was at this point, a lot of friends I knew were having kids, and many were on the autistic spectrum. And so, for example, in the Universal Tricompax, which I do own and love, an incredible, sophisticated, complicated, brilliant watch. There's a gorgeous moon phase, the Man in the Moon, because it's a very early edition in the 1947, I think. But in any case, I knew one boy who was inconsolable, but the moon calmed him down. Okay. It was one of those things. So, and seeing that, I thought, oh, maybe he would like the moon phase, or the father thinks he likes the moon phase. So it's a man who can't connect with anyone, really trying to connect to a kid who, because of his disability, finds it very difficult. It's a communicative disorder, right? So he can't really connect. So, but then the other part of that was, as I was getting into the watch world, I would also go to these meetings of watch nerds. And what I noticed, and I don't mean to be diagnostic, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but that there was, I think a lot of these men I met were also having difficulty communicating in, some were very gregarious. Some I know are very gregarious, but some are far better adept at saying, it's the DUW 3000 movement or whatever. And than actually saying, well, my father died, I'm very sad, or something like that. I never knew the man really. So that this became, and I know that men do this over things like, baseball scores and whatever, but I never cared about that. So this became, in a weird way, and a lot of my characters in my books have been women, but this because a lot of my friends have been women over the years, but then I started finding a new kind of male cohort around watches, and I sort of we used our secret language to communicate. But also they were very helpful, when COVID happened, this one fella, it was very hard to get a vaccine shot. They were just coming out, and I emailed him, and next day my whole family was vaccinated.
And you knew this guy through the watch collecting?
Through the watch world, yeah. And I was telling my wife, I was like, yeah, you think it's a stupid hobby, but you just saved their life, right?
So you mentioned that you're going to have to get on stage and you're going to read that article out for all of us, because we are here at the NOMOS Forum, the 4th annual NOMOS Forum in Glashütte. Altogether, a huge amount of people have come in from all over the world, retailers, collectors, influencers, manfluencers, famous New York writers, and of course, accidental ambassadors, as I mentioned at the top of the show. So you bought that Minimatic. It's a first edition Champagne Neomatic watch from 2015 with a DUW 3001 movement inside it. It has a couple of strange quirks about the dial, which don't feature on the following Minimatic collection, and that is that the Neomatic print is in RAL 2005 orange, and the subdial is encircled with 2 rings of the same color.
Now he's bragging, Gary.
No, he's great.
He's communicating with us.
You could be, I don't know.
I could work for NOMOS.
Work for NOMOS, and you could be sort of the horological priest who could.
Oh, well, that's something to think about.
Yes, this is, when I saw this watch, it was amazing. everything just clicked. I thought, wow, this the orange especially was very interesting. I know there's become a motif with Nomos, but it's here. I really prefer the first edition to the second because of the judicious use of orange. The strap is not this color normally. It is a sort of more flesh-like strap, if you will.
Let's call it nude.
Nude. It's a little nude. It's a little nude. And I'm not a nude disc kind of guy because nobody should see this much fur. So what I did was I decided to make it less nude, to put some stuff on it. So I would keep it out in the sun next to my pool, let the mist in the morning roll in, soften up a little in the sun. And it created almost a kind of shellac-like consistency to it, which I really like, and a different color. The patina is great. Yeah, the patina is great because the watch itself will not patina, obviously. But so I've become sort of a strap farmer. I'm trying to see if this is can I get like a tax break from New York State as a strap farmer? Possibly.
Quite possibly. Certainly is an art form, that's for sure. You know, there's something else about the Minimatic dial that I think a lot of people don't notice. And when we're talking about patina, we should touch on it. And that's with small gold-toned hour markers.
Oh, yeah, they're milled in, aren't they? Yeah.
So they're drilled through to reveal the substrate of the dial. And we don't really know yet when they're gonna patina, if they're gonna patina.
Yeah, do you think they will? I'm not even sure.
It depends.
Depends, right? Well, yeah, and that goes back to my favorite Rolex models, right? The gilt models. I mean, that's in a much bigger form, but yeah, I absolutely love the idea. If we're nostalgics or historically minded, the idea that there's substrata to this dial and there's more and more stuff that's going to appear, that's very exciting.
On topic of fatherhood, your son is around 9, 10, I guess. 10 almost. Did he catch the watch bug?
No, and I've tried everything. I bought him swatches, that thing, that the pre-swatch, whatever that's called. Flick-flack, thank you. And I'm like, isn't this cool? It could be just like Daddy. And he's like, eh. Like, he does like to swim in them sometimes. Yeah, because that's a cool feeling that you can take some... It's a great feeling when you can take a mechanical object, an electric object, and submerge it. So he does. He's a little bit into that, but and he weirdly enough has a big wrist. I have a tiny wrist, but he's growing. So I think the Air King can now fit him, and I'm like, do you want this? And then I'm like, but if he takes a Rolex to school, then that's not a good look for a public school kid.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot all at once.
Yeah.
Hi, this is my Rolex.
This is my Rolex. You have to wind it. It's an automatic. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about your feelings towards the brand of Nomos, because that's what's brought us together and established a new friendship that I hope continues for many more years of obsession, mutual obsession. So what is it you like about the brand, and maybe even what is it you don't like about the brand?
Listen, this is... The people I know who have Nomoses, either I help them buy it or they stumble onto it themselves. These are cool people. This is... yesterday I was telling you guys a story about how I went to this restaurant and these 6, 7 men walked in. They were all in property development in New York. They were saying awful stuff about the waitress who was not physically appealing to them, just horrible human beings. And I looked over and they were all wearing various Royal Oaks, some had the offshore, and I was like, wow. And they also all looked like they were like dynasties, their parents have done this and now they're just jerks together. But Nomos, to me, I've never met anyone who has a Nomos who I haven't liked. It's just a brand for people who are not ostentatious, but also have a kind of discreet, quasi-European, perhaps, sense of style, definitely leaning into aesthetics like the Werkbund and the Bauhaus. Many artists, graphic designers, head of a museum, journalists. The story I'm going to tell at the end of my lecture, as they here call it, which is nothing like that, but a very dear friend of mine died recently, and he knew he had cancer, and he was in his 50s, and he said, I've never owned a beautiful watch. I think this might be the time. So we looked through watches and he found the Nomos Metro. Beautiful, beautiful. The blue dial, the Nacht Blue. And, he was beloved by many people, so he was always surrounded by people. But in the end, I think he had to spend a lot of time in isolation, and that watch became a kind of companion. So that was one way in which what may seem to some a trivial object became to him something important in the last days of his life.
And did he leave it to his son?
He didn't have any children. He has a wonderful wife. So yeah, we talked about that with her, and she said, it's too big for my wrist. So I think she's just going to keep it. It's too big for her wrist as well, but she doesn't wear watches. But I don't know. There's, he was a very great writer, and she has collected all the stuff, and I think that's a very important part of his life.
It's interesting that at that moment when he had all the reason in the world to, make a very important decision for himself personally, thinking this watch is going to be my watch. It's going to be the watch that I buy for myself at this challenging time in his life, that he went for a NOMOS. I mean, it does speak volumes, I think, like when you strip away all of the things that a watch can be to other people, and you think about what is it that a watch needs to be to yourself, what design sensibilities does it need to fulfill, what expectations does it need to meet, and you pare everything back. And maybe it comes down sometimes to just the simplicity of that flowing second hand, as you said.
Yes. I mean, I remember when I showed him my collection, and for example, I think Rolex was not an option at all because he just didn't connect to it. It seemed like it was overbuilt yes, I think if you're a sporty person, perhaps it makes sense, but it was definitely this large thing. It also had, I think at this point didn't care about the connotation of what people would think about him, but it also seemed like very mass-produced, not that NOMOS isn't, but I think they put a lot of thought and work into it. But, it was, and then there were things like Patek that are frankly out of reach for most people, and Longa as well. But NOMOS ticked all the boxes, and it looks like it's very much an instrument. It's very much something that, there's no frills to it. It's the design, form follows function, which was, of course, a Werkbund and a Bauhaus kind of aesthetic, all of it. But at the same time, it looks like an expensive watch and feels like an expensive watch. It doesn't feel at all disposable, which a lot of watches, I think, even, God bless them, a lot of the micro brands under the $1,000 mark, et cetera, that are now flooding. Many of them are good. I own a couple, but this is, I think, really a cut above. There was an article in, I think, SJX about man hours devoted to watches, really good article, and it mentioned, and NOMOS was punching way above its category. It was above, I think, the Rolex Grand Seiko tier of industrial manufacture, right? So it was surrounded by far, like Piaget, far more expensive, I may be wrong about, but you can check, far more expensive watchmakers. So you are getting crap loads of value for your dollar. And I think a lot of that has to do with, here we are in distressed Saxony as opposed to billionaire row in Geneva. So I think that makes a big difference. And I would say out of the 15 or so watches, my last watches that I bought, I would say almost the majority are Japanese or German because they're better and more interesting, not tied to all the Swiss conservatism that is,
I definitely agree with you, and it's an interesting point to raise that SJX article, because when you look at watches in terms of the man hours that go into their creation, you find that there can be some consistency as to why. And you mentioned Piaget being alongside NOMOS. What's not surprising about that is both brands are known for their extremely thin movements.
Yes.
And the thinner something is, the more handwork and cajoling it can take to get it to work.
No, I was saying how most complications don't do anything for me except maybe GMT and date, which I find very useful. But I consider thinness a very important complication. Now, I don't know, I'm sure there's a dissertation on gender that can be put in there and my own views toward gender, which are, complicated. But definitely the over-engineering of certain watches to subscribe to some masculine ideal of heft and strength and musculature. I never got that. I never, to me, if you're going over 13 millimeters in heights, what are you doing? What's it for? There's got to be some incredible, this watch better fly you to Mars, with Elon and stuff. It's got to be super incredible because otherwise it's just showing off in some ways. But I do think thinness is an incredible, and I have probably 10 watches that are under 10 millimeters. One, the Saxonia Thin is even smaller, but that's absolutely what I love about NOMOS. the fact that, I think it's all 7, 8, sometimes even less.
So you seem like a historian, a fan of American politics or the history of it, or an interested person. Shall we say that maybe that NOMOS' motto should be speak softly and wear a slim watch?
Yeah. No, it's funny. I mean, the Donald had, of course, the day date at a gigantic yellow gold day date, which, is a watch that I like and some metaphysical level, but would never wear. What did Obama just had something his bodyguard gave him, but then he got a Rolex Cellini. So
last question from Alan, then we got to wrap it up.
Last one. We have so many, but we got the signal. Gary needs to take the stage. A very quick one for our dear listeners that are not that familiar with the Shteyngart universe. Definitely try to read Lake Success. I'll promise you enjoy it as a watch nerd. What other books would you recommend our dear listeners that are not that familiar with your work?
Let's see. Well, the last book, Our Country Friends, was about the pandemic. So if you haven't gotten enough of the pandemic, this is the book for you. I think my best-selling book ever was Super Sad True Love Story, which is a romance set against a horrible future. That was published in 2010. Most of the horrible future has already happened. So the book was fairly prescient, but like the Nostradamus of 2 weeks from now. If you're into the current war against Ukraine by the genocidal Russian government, Absurdistan, maybe you look at that. There's a kind of, the main character is sort of like Prigozhin, the rebel leader, that's sort of Prigozhin's son is the main character. So yeah, a couple of books there for you. But if for watch nerds, Lake Success, yes. Even if you hate everything else about the book, you will like all the Pateks and Nomoses in there. Yeah.
What a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much, Gary, for your time. And hopefully we can get you back on in the future for another episode. If you have any questions for Gary or you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so on Instagram. I'm there at RobNuds, ROBNUDDS. Alon can be found at ALONBENJOSEPH. You can contact us on our email accounts, either Rob or Alon at therealtime.show, or via the contact form on the website, www.therealtime.show. We'll be back soon with another Q&A session and another interview with one of watchmaking's finest. Until then, stay safe and keep on ticking.